The sky was overcast, casting a somber mood over the small-town cemetery. A group of mourners stood gathered around a freshly dug grave, their heads bowed in sorrow. Eleanor had been a kind soul, someone who had dedicated her life to helping others, both humans and animals alike. Her passing had left a deep void in the community. People whispered about how sudden her death had been. She had always been strong, full of life, yet now she was gone. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers had come to pay their final respects. The priest stood before the coffin, speaking solemn words about Eleanor's generosity, her compassion, and the countless lives she had touched. As the priest continued, a hush fell over the crowd. People turned their heads, eyes widening in disbelief. From the distance, emerging from the thick tree line near the cemetery, a large brown bear walked forward with slow, deliberate steps. Gasps rippled through the crowd, some stepping back in fear, while others stood frozen in place. The bear was massive, towering over even the tallest men, its fur thick and unkempt. Its dark eyes were locked onto the wooden coffin resting above the grave. The animal moved closer, its heavy paws pressing into the damp earth, leaving deep imprints behind. Some mourners whispered frantically, urging others to move away. A few parents clutched their children's hands tightly, their instincts screaming that the creature was dangerous. Yet the bear did not behave aggressively. It did not growl or roar. Instead, it approached with a solemn, almost sorrowful demeanor. It stopped just a few feet from the coffin, lowering its head slightly as if paying its own respects. A few elderly townspeople exchanged looks, recognition dawning in their eyes. Some of them remembered stories about Eleanor and the bear from years ago, though many had dismissed them as exaggerated tales. Yet here, standing before them, was proof that those stories had been true. A few braver souls dared to step forward, observing the bear more closely. It made no move to attack, its massive chest rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. It seemed oblivious to the murmuring crowd, its attention fixed entirely on Eleanor's coffin. As the priest hesitated, unsure of how to proceed, the bear took another step forward. The undertaker, who had been preparing to lower the coffin into the grave, instinctively stepped back, unsure of what would happen next. The animal then did something that left the entire town in stunned silence. It lay down beside the coffin, pressing its large body close as though seeking warmth from the woman it had once known. The bear remained still, its deep brown eyes filled with something that looked like grief. A few people wiped away tears, shaken by the sight of such a powerful creature, mourning the loss of a human. For some, it was a sign of the special bond Eleanor had with animals. For others, it was deeply unsettling. A few men quietly debated whether they should try to drive the bear away, fearing it might suddenly become aggressive. However, there was something about the creature's posture, its absolute stillness, that stopped them. It was as if the bear understood what was happening, as if it had come to say goodbye. Time seemed to stretch as the bear lay there, unmoving. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees, but no one dared to speak. The priest, unsure of what else to do, resumed the ceremony, his voice softer now, as if respecting the presence of the grieving animal. The moment the first handful of soil was thrown onto the coffin, the bear let out a deep, mournful sound, one that sent chills down the spines of those present. It was not a roar, it was something else, a low, sorrowful moan, filled with pain. As the ceremony concluded, the mourners began to leave, speaking in hushed voices about what they had just witnessed. Yet the bear remained. It did not move from its spot, its large form still curled around the coffin as the sun began to set. Even as darkness fell, the animal showed no signs of leaving. The gravediggers hesitated, unsure of whether they should proceed. But one thing was clear: this bear was not ready to say goodbye. The town had never seen anything like it. Hours passed, yet the bear refused to leave Eleanor's coffin. As darkness settled over the cemetery, the last few mourners hesitated before finally departing, glancing back at the massive creature lying still beside the grave. Some whispered to each other, speculating about the bear's connection to Eleanor, while others simply shook their heads in disbelief. The undertaker and his assistants, unsure of what to do, decided to leave the burial unfinished for the night. No one dared to disturb the grieving animal. As the cold night air crept in, a few of the older townspeople sat around a fireplace in the local inn, discussing the remarkable event. It was then that a frail old man, Henry, cleared his throat and spoke with certainty. "That bear is Bruno," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Eleanor saved him when he was just a cub." The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward Henry, waiting for him to explain. Years ago, when Eleanor was younger, she had lived in a small cabin near the forest's edge. She had always been different from the other townsfolk, preferring the company of nature over social gatherings. People respected her, but they also found her ways peculiar. She would often take in stray animals, nurse injured birds, and leave food out for wandering creatures. But there was one story that stood out among them all, the story of Bruno. One evening, Eleanor had been walking through the woods when she stumbled upon a gruesome scene. A mother bear had been killed by poachers, her massive body lying motionless on the forest floor. Nearby, a tiny cub, no older than a few months, whimpered helplessly, pressing itself against its mother's lifeless form. Eleanor had always loved animals, but this moment struck something deeper in her heart. She could not walk away. She knew that without its mother, the cub would not survive. Ignoring the risks, she carefully approached the tiny bear, speaking in soft tones to soothe its fear. The cub was weak and shivering, its small frame barely able to stand. Eleanor scooped it into her arms, holding it close to her chest as she made her way back to her cabin. From that night on, she became the cub's guardian. At first, it had been difficult. The bear, whom she later named Bruno, was frightened and unfamiliar with human care. He would claw and bite when scared, and Eleanor had the scars to prove it. But she was patient. She fed him warm milk, wrapped him in blankets during cold nights, and spent hours sitting beside him, earning his trust. As weeks turned into months, Bruno grew stronger. He followed Eleanor everywhere, waddling clumsily behind her as she tended to her small garden or fetched water from the stream. But as Bruno grew, so did the challenges. A bear was not meant to live among humans forever. Eleanor knew this better than anyone. When Bruno became too large to stay inside the cabin, she made the painful decision to release him back into the wild. She led him deep into the forest, taking him to an area where he could survive on his own. She left food for him at first, making sure he could fend for himself. Eventually, she stopped leaving food, hoping he would adapt. The day he did not return to her cabin was the day she knew he had finally become part of the wild again. Years passed, and Eleanor continued her simple life, never forgetting the bear she had raised. Sometimes, when she ventured into the woods, she would catch glimpses of Bruno from a distance. He had grown into a massive, powerful bear, yet he never seemed to forget her. Occasionally, she would find paw prints near her cabin, as if he had been checking on her. Though she never spoke much about it, some townspeople knew the story and respected her bond with the animal. Now, as Henry finished his tale, the room remained silent. The weight of his words hung heavily in the air. The bear lying beside Eleanor's coffin was no ordinary animal. He was a creature that had been saved by her kindness, raised by her hands, and then returned to the wild. Yet in the end, he had found his way back to her, even in death. The next morning, when the townspeople gathered again at the cemetery, Bruno was still there. The grave diggers, hesitant to move forward with the burial, waited for guidance. Some suggested calling animal control, fearing that the bear would never leave. Others, however, believed that Bruno deserved time to grieve, just as any human would. The sight of the massive creature mourning its former caretaker stirred something deep within the townspeople. Many who had once been wary of Eleanor's bond with animals now saw it in a different light. The bear had come not as a threat, but as a companion in sorrow. As the sun rose higher in the sky, whispers of doubt began to spread. Why had Eleanor passed so suddenly? She had not been sick. She had not shown any signs of weakness. The timing of her death, so unexpected, unsettled some of the townsfolk. It was then that Dr. Harrison, the town's physician, began to question if something more had happened. The pieces of the puzzle did not quite fit. Something was wrong. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the cemetery as the townspeople returned, hoping to see whether the bear had finally left. But Bruno had not moved. He remained by Eleanor's coffin, his massive body stretched across the ground, his head resting near the wooden lid as if he could still feel her presence. His breathing was slow and heavy, and his eyes held an unmistakable sadness. Some townspeople whispered that it was unnatural for a bear to behave this way, while others believed it was the purest form of grief they had ever witnessed. As the hours passed, the discussions among the townsfolk grew more divided. Some felt the bear needed to be driven away before he became a danger to the public. Parents worried about their children wandering too close. A few men, armed with rifles, suggested that the only way to resolve the situation was by force. But before any decision could be made, an elderly woman named Margaret stepped forward. She had known Eleanor well and had always admired her deep connection with animals. With careful steps, she approached Bruno, her frail hands holding a small bowl of water. The crowd watched in silence as Margaret knelt a few feet away from the bear. She placed the bowl on the ground and whispered softly, though no one could hear her exact words. Bruno did not react aggressively. Instead, he lifted his head slightly, his dark eyes glistening in the morning light. He looked at Margaret, then at the bowl, but did not move any closer. After a long moment, he let out a deep sigh and rested his head back against the coffin. It was clear Bruno was not here to harm anyone. He was mourning. The sight of the grieving bear stirred emotions, even in those who had been skeptical. Some began bringing food and water, setting it down near the grave, though Bruno ignored it all. It was as if he had no interest in anything but being close to Eleanor. The funeral had ended the day before, yet the town could not move on, not while Bruno remained at the cemetery, unwilling to leave. Hours turned into an entire day, then another. The mayor of the town, a practical man who had initially wanted to call for wildlife officials, found himself hesitating. He had never believed animals had emotions like humans, yet watching Bruno, he could no longer deny it. He decided that, for now, they would let the bear stay. Perhaps, when he was ready, he would leave on his own. Despite the mayor's decision, tension continued to build. Some feared that the bear's presence would attract more wild animals. Others were concerned about safety, especially with children visiting the cemetery to see the unusual sight. Parents held their little ones close, warning them not to go near, though curiosity still lingered in their young eyes. The town was divided. Some wanted to let nature take its course, while others saw the bear as an unpredictable threat. As the days passed, something even stranger began to unfold. People started recalling the way Eleanor had died. So suddenly, so unexpectedly. She had been in good health, full of energy, yet one morning she was simply gone. There had been no prior signs of illness, no warnings. It did not sit right with some, especially Dr. Harrison, who had always admired Eleanor's resilience. He had been there when she was pronounced dead, but something about it had always troubled him. The doctor found himself thinking back to the moment he had seen Eleanor for the last time. She had been found lying peacefully in her home, with no signs of struggle. The townspeople had assumed it was a natural death, given her age. But now, with the bear's presence stirring memories and emotions, doubt crept into his mind. What if there had been something more? Dr. Harrison decided he could no longer ignore his suspicions. He needed to take a closer look at Eleanor's body. But it would not be easy. Exhuming a grave was not a simple matter. It required permission, and many in town would find it disrespectful. Yet his instincts told him that something was wrong. As he watched the bear lying next to the coffin, refusing to leave, he began to wonder. Did Bruno sense something that no one else could? The doctor took his concerns to the mayor, explaining his unease. At first, the mayor dismissed it. Eleanor had lived a long life, and there had been no immediate reason to suspect foul play. But Dr. Harrison was persistent. He reminded the mayor that Eleanor had always been healthy and active, and her sudden death did not make sense. The presence of the bear only deepened his suspicions. After much debate, the mayor reluctantly agreed. If it would put the town at ease, they would allow an examination. Word spread quickly, and soon the entire town knew that an investigation was about to take place. Some were outraged, believing it was disrespectful to disturb Eleanor's rest. Others, however, were curious. What if something had happened that no one had noticed? What if there was a reason Bruno had not left? That evening, as the townspeople gathered in small groups, discussing what would come next, Bruno remained by the coffin, unmoving. He had barely eaten, barely reacted to the people who had come and gone. He seemed to be waiting for something. Whether it was closure or the truth, no one could say. But one thing was clear. Whatever was about to be uncovered, Bruno already knew. The town was abuzz with whispers and speculation as the decision to investigate Eleanor's cause of death spread. While some saw it as a necessary step, others were deeply unsettled by the thought of disturbing her rest. But Dr. Harrison could not ignore his instincts. Something about Eleanor's passing had felt wrong from the start, and now, with Bruno's inexplicable grief, he was convinced that there was more to the story. The mayor, though reluctant, arranged for a small team to oversee the examination. Eleanor's closest friends and a few trusted officials were present, ensuring that the process was handled with care and respect. As the wooden coffin was gently lifted from the grave, the crowd watched in silence. The air was thick with tension, and even the birds in the trees seemed to have gone quiet. Bruno, who had remained by the grave for days, suddenly lifted his head. His ears perked up, and his dark eyes fixated on the men carefully unsealing the coffin. His massive body tensed, but he did not move. It was as if he sensed that something important was happening. The people closest to the scene exchanged nervous glances, half expecting the bear to react violently. But instead, he simply watched. Dr. Harrison took a deep breath before leaning in. Eleanor's body had been well preserved, her peaceful expression unchanged since the day she had been laid to rest. At first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. There were no marks, no signs of struggle, just as it had been when she was first discovered. But as the doctor examined her closely, a flicker of doubt passed through his mind. He checked her hands, her skin, her eyes, looking for anything that might explain the unease he felt. And then, as he gently lifted the delicate fabric around her neck, his heart skipped a beat. There, just beneath the skin, was a faint discoloration, a tiny mark, barely visible to the untrained eye. His breath caught in his throat. This was not the natural passing of an elderly woman. This was something else entirely. Dr. Harrison turned to the mayor, his voice low but urgent. "She didn't die of natural causes," he said. The mayor frowned, stepping closer. "What do you mean?" he asked, though the concern in his eyes showed that he already suspected the answer. The doctor hesitated for a moment, then carefully examined Eleanor's lips. There it was again, an unnatural tint, something that could easily go unnoticed if no one was looking for it. "This looks like poisoning," Dr. Harrison finally said, his voice steady but grim. A collective gasp rippled through the small crowd. People glanced at one another, shock and disbelief etched across their faces. Poisoning? Who would do such a thing? And why? The mayor's expression darkened. "Are you certain?" he asked, though he already knew the doctor would not make such a claim without good reason. Dr. Harrison nodded. "I'll need further tests to be completely sure, but everything points to it. Someone didn't want Eleanor to live." The revelation sent waves of unease through the town. Eleanor had been beloved by so many. Who could possibly have wished her harm? The mere thought of foul play unsettled everyone, especially those who had considered her a friend. The news spread quickly, and by evening, the entire town was talking about it. As night fell, Bruno remained at the cemetery, watching from a distance as people whispered among themselves. Some now saw his presence in a different light. Perhaps he had known all along. Perhaps he had sensed that Eleanor's death had not been natural. And if that were the case, what else did he know? The bear's loyalty took on a new meaning. He had not simply come to mourn. He had come because something was wrong. The more people thought about it, the more they realized that animals often sense things before humans did. Had Bruno been trying to tell them something all this time? Dr. Harrison knew that the real work was only beginning. Eleanor's sudden death had been suspicious from the start, and now, with evidence pointing to poisoning, he needed to uncover the truth. Who had done this? And what had they hoped to gain? He did not have the answers yet, but one thing was certain. Eleanor had been taken before her time, and Bruno, her oldest and most faithful companion, had known it before anyone else. The news of Eleanor's possible poisoning spread through the town like wildfire. Shock turned to speculation, and speculation quickly became fear. Who among them had done this? Eleanor had no known enemies. She was a woman of kindness, someone who had dedicated her life to helping animals and those in need. The idea that someone had wanted her dead was almost impossible to believe, but the evidence was there. Dr. Harrison had no doubt. The mayor wasted no time in calling for an investigation. A small team, including the town's sheriff and a few trusted officials, began questioning those who had last seen Eleanor alive. They went to her home, searching for anything that could offer clues. Her cabin, still untouched since her passing, was filled with remnants of her simple yet fulfilling life. Herbs and dried flowers hung from the wooden beams. Books on nature and animal care lined the shelves. Nothing seemed out of place until they reached the kitchen. Dr. Harrison, who had accompanied the sheriff, noticed something immediately. A small teacup sat on the table, its contents long since dried. He stepped closer, inspecting the rim. A faint, almost undetectable residue clung to the edges. His pulse quickened. "We need to test this," he said firmly. The sheriff nodded, already making arrangements for the cup to be analyzed. If poison had been used, this could be the key to finding out what had happened. Meanwhile, the townspeople began piecing together their own theories. Some believed it was an accident, that perhaps Eleanor had unknowingly consumed something toxic from the forest. Others, however, were not so sure. Whispers of foul play grew louder, and eyes turned toward those who might have had a reason to harm her. Then a discovery changed everything. The town's clerk, while reviewing old records, found something unusual. Eleanor had owned a large piece of land, far more than most had realized. It had been in her family for generations, but she had never spoken about it much. Recently, however, there had been talks of development in the area. If sold, the land could have been worth a fortune. But Eleanor, true to her nature, had refused to part with it. She had wanted it to remain untouched, a sanctuary for the wildlife she loved so dearly. This revelation sent suspicion in a new direction. Had someone wanted Eleanor out of the way to claim her land? The idea made people uneasy. Who would have had the means to poison her? Who stood to gain the most? Dr. Harrison and the sheriff dug deeper. They examined Eleanor's will, which had been updated just a year before her death. To no one's surprise, she had left everything to charity, ensuring that her land would never be sold or destroyed. But there was one name that stood out. Her distant relatives, whom she had cut ties with years ago, had been completely removed from her will. The relatives had never been close to Eleanor. They had lived in another town, rarely visiting, and had only shown interest in her estate when money was involved. Yet now they had resurfaced, expressing deep sorrow over her passing. To those who knew Eleanor well, their sudden concern seemed insincere. And as the investigation continued, more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. It was soon discovered that one of these relatives had been in town the week before Eleanor's death. A neighbor recalled seeing a man she did not recognize near Eleanor's home late one evening. Another claimed to have overheard a conversation about getting what's owed. At first, these seemed like small, unrelated details. But as they gathered more information, a disturbing truth began to emerge. Dr. Harrison's tests confirmed their worst fears. The teacup had contained traces of a toxic substance, one that could have easily caused Eleanor's death without leaving obvious signs. The poison had been carefully chosen, designed to mimic a natural passing. But why? The answer was now clear. Someone had wanted Eleanor gone before she could make her final wishes legally binding. The sheriff and his team wasted no time in tracking down her relatives. When confronted, one of them, a man named Richard, grew nervous. He denied everything at first, but his lies quickly unraveled. Witnesses placed him near Eleanor's home, and further investigation uncovered documents showing that he had been seeking legal advice about her estate just days before she died. It was all the proof they needed. Richard had poisoned Eleanor, hoping to inherit her land before she could finalize her plans to donate it. When the truth was finally revealed to the town, there was a mix of relief and heartbreak. Eleanor had not died naturally. She had been taken too soon, betrayed by her own blood. The knowledge stung, but at least justice would be served. Richard was arrested, and legal proceedings began to ensure that Eleanor's final wishes would be honored. Through it all, Bruno remained. The bear had known, in a way that no human had. He had felt the loss, the injustice, and had refused to leave Eleanor's side until the truth was uncovered. Some believed it was simply the loyalty of an animal, but others saw something deeper, a connection that went beyond understanding. As the town processed the shocking revelation, Bruno continued to keep watch, his massive frame still resting beside Eleanor's grave. He had done what no one else could. He had mourned, he had waited, and in doing so, he had led them to the truth. The town was forever changed by the truth. News of Eleanor's murder spread beyond the small community, drawing the attention of reporters and officials. Many struggled to accept that someone could have taken the life of such a kind and selfless woman. But even as justice was served and Richard was taken into custody, there was one presence that had not wavered: Bruno. Days had passed, yet the bear remained near Eleanor's grave, refusing to leave. The sheriff, the mayor, and even Dr. Harrison watched from a distance, uncertain of what to do. The townspeople had grown used to his presence, and though some still feared him, many had come to see him as a guardian rather than a threat. Food and water were placed near the grave, but Bruno hardly touched any of it. It was clear that his mourning had not yet ended. As the town tried to move forward, another discovery was made, one that deepened the mystery surrounding Eleanor's life. While reviewing her personal belongings, officials found a collection of old letters hidden inside a wooden chest. These letters, written in delicate, flowing handwriting, detailed something no one had expected. Eleanor had once been engaged. The revelation stunned those who had known her. She had always lived alone, never speaking of any romantic past. Yet the letters revealed a love story filled with devotion, heartbreak, and an unfulfilled promise. The man's name was Thomas, and he had once been the love of Eleanor's life. They had planned to marry when they were young, but fate had separated them. Thomas had been called away for war, and Eleanor had waited faithfully for his return. But he never came back. For years, she had written him letters, believing he would one day respond. She had held on to hope that he was still out there, waiting just as she was, but eventually silence became her answer. She had never married, never moved on, choosing instead to dedicate her life to the animals that needed her. The letters were a glimpse into a part of her life that no one had known, a love she had lost but never forgotten. One letter in particular stood out. It was written later than the others, decades after she had stopped writing to Thomas. In it, she spoke of Bruno. She wrote about how the bear reminded her of the love she had once known, how his presence had filled the empty space in her heart. She described him as her closest companion, a creature that had saved her just as she had once saved him. As the townspeople read these words, their understanding of Bruno's devotion deepened. He was more than just a bear mourning his caretaker. He was a soul that had shared a connection with Eleanor that no one else had. He had been her family when she had no one else. He had been the only constant in her life after she had lost everything. Some of the townspeople began to believe that Bruno's presence was not just grief, it was loyalty. He was not simply mourning Eleanor's passing. He was ensuring that she was not alone. Just as she had stayed by his side when he was a vulnerable cub, he now stayed by hers. The mayor, deeply moved by the discovery, made a decision. The land that Eleanor had fought to protect would remain untouched. It would be turned into a sanctuary in her honor, a place where animals could roam freely, safe from harm. It would be her legacy, one that Bruno himself would be a part of. The town agreed, and soon work began to preserve the land she had cherished so dearly. Even as the plans for the sanctuary moved forward, Bruno remained. Some believed he would never leave, that he would stay by Eleanor's grave for as long as he lived. But then, on a quiet morning, just as the sun was rising, something changed. A few early risers who had come to check on Bruno found him standing beside the grave, his head raised toward the sky. For the first time in days, he seemed different, calm, as if something within him had settled. He stood there for a long moment, then without a sound, he turned and walked toward the forest. The townspeople watched in silence as he disappeared into the trees. There was no hesitation in his steps, no sign of distress. It was as if he knew his job was done. Eleanor had found peace, and now, so had he. Though Bruno was gone, his presence remained in the hearts of those who had witnessed his devotion. The sanctuary was completed in Eleanor's honor, a testament to the bond between humans and animals, a reminder that love and loyalty transcended even death. And so the town moved forward, forever changed by the story of a woman and a bear. Two souls who had found each other, lost each other, and, in the end, never truly said goodbye. The days that followed Bruno's departure were filled with reflection. The town had seen something extraordinary, something that would be told for generations to come. Eleanor's grave had become a place of quiet reverence, not just because of the mystery surrounding her death, but because of what the bear had taught them all. His loyalty, his grief, and his silent determination to stay by her side had moved even the most skeptical hearts. The land that Eleanor had fought so hard to protect was no longer in danger. Instead, it had been transformed into the Eleanor Wildlife Sanctuary, a place where animals could roam freely without the threat of hunters or developers. The people who once saw animals as distant, untamed creatures now viewed them with new understanding. The story of Eleanor and Bruno had changed them, reminding them that love and devotion were not limited to humans alone. Bruno was never seen in town again. Some believed he had returned to the deepest parts of the forest, back to the life Eleanor had once wished for him. Others believed he still watched over her, perhaps returning to the grave in the quiet of the night when no one was around. Either way, he had left on his own terms, his final act one of acceptance. His job was done. Dr. Harrison continued to visit Eleanor's grave, often bringing fresh flowers as a sign of respect. He had been the one to uncover the truth, but he knew that, in some way, Bruno had always known. The bear had sensed the loss before anyone else, had understood the injustice when others did not. And in his quiet, unwavering presence, he had led the town to the answers they never would have sought on their own. The sanctuary became a lasting tribute, not only to Eleanor, but to the connection between humans and the creatures they shared the world with. Visitors would come from other towns, drawn by the story that had spread far beyond the cemetery gates. People would stand by Eleanor's grave, reading the plaque that honored her life, and some would leave small tokens, flowers, stones, even drawings of a bear standing protectively over a woman's coffin. The town had changed, but one thing remained certain. The bond between Eleanor and Bruno was not something that could ever be forgotten. It had transcended time, words, and even death. It was a testament to love, loyalty, and the kind of friendship that needed no explanation. If you were moved by this story, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more incredible tales of loyalty, survival, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and animals. Every story holds a lesson, every connection has meaning, and we are here to share them with you. Don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring story again. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.